Okay, so what are my aims? One, I want to introduce you to a difficult but important ethical problem. Climate change is, the sort of issue of our time. It's not just climate change. It might have to deal with depletion of ocean fisheries, multinational corporations and the handling and dumping of toxic waste. There's all these sorts of climate issues or environmental issues that come up, but climate change is the one that Velasquez focuses on the most. I also want to show you the relevance of philosophy, which is my field, it's my discipline, as well as other disciplines like English, history, psychology, to these important issues. So this is common cause, right? So it's from the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences. And so I want to sort of throw in how these other disciplines can impact our discussion here as well. And then in particular, I want to show you the importance of the history of philosophy to these issues. So for instance, it's sometimes said, it's wondered, why should we study these past philosophers who were writing 300, 1,000 years ago? Well, I want to show you why we're doing that, right? Part of the reason why we're doing that is because they were introducing problems, maybe sometimes solutions that we're still wrestling with today. They might manifest themselves in new forms, but they're still most fundamentally the central problems. And so we will look at Thomas Hobbes, for instance, in the history of philosophy, and how he's relevant to this discussion. Okay. So let me say a little bit about Thomas Hobbes. What we'll do is we'll look at Hobbes's thought, and then we'll get into Velasquez and how he uses Hobbes's thought to talk about the issue of multinational corporations. So Thomas Hobbes, kind of a scary-looking guy there, born in 1588. So a 16th and 17th century philosopher. He was born in 1588 as the Spanish Armada hung off the coast of England. He attended Oxford University, very critical of Oxford University, but he attended and graduated from Oxford University. He lived through the English Civil War, which was a very bloody civil war, and he defended the monarchy against the parliamentarians. All of this will kind of come out in his philosophy as well, as we'll see. He was exiled for a time in France. And probably his most well-known work is titled Leviathan, which was published in 1658. Leviathan refers to government. And so we'll sort of dig into some of his thoughts in Leviathan here and his view of political philosophy, what he thinks that justifies the state, what justifies government. So let's get into Hobbes here a bit. So Hobbes is asking the question in Leviathan, right? He's asking the question, what justifies the existence of the state? What justifies the existence of government? This is something we don't tend to think about too much. We kind of take government or the state for granted, but it kind of is a remarkable thing if you think about it, right? It could be the case that somebody could walk in here right now, and just because they're wearing a badge, they could put my hands behind my back, cuff me, and put me in a cell, right? They could take away my freedom. They could take away my liberty. In some states, they can even take away your life, right? That's a separate ethical issue if we're talking about capital punishment, right? But we give the state, we give the government all of this power, right? We give them all of this authority. Well, what justifies that, right? I can't do that to somebody else. What permits some stranger from doing this, right? What permits the courts? What gives the courts their authority? What gives the police their authority? What gives politicians their authority? That's one of the most fundamental questions of political philosophy, which is what justifies the existence of the state. And that's the question that Hobbes is wrestling with in Leviathan. He also talks about ethics. He also talks about metaphysics and epistemology. But most fundamentally, it's really a treatise in political philosophy. And so to answer that question, right, because Hobbes does think the state is justified. He's not an anarchist. If you're an anarchist, you believe that the state isn't justified. Usually not because you just want to do whatever you want. Usually anarchists have a heightened sense of morality. They think that the very existence of the state trumps your rights, right? So you can't give anybody that authority. You can't give public officials that authority because I have the right to freedom and liberty and to do what I want. Hobbes is not an anarchist. He thinks that the state is justified. He just wants to give an answer to that question, what justifies the existence of the state? And he came up with a method that was very influential to try to answer this question. And many philosophers writing after Hobbes would use this method. So John Locke will use this method after Hobbes. Jean-Jacques Rousseau will use this method after Hobbes. as well as more contemporary philosophers like Robert Nozick will use this method. They'll all disagree on what implications they'll draw. Today we'll just look at Hobbes, so I won't get into those other thinkers. So the method is this. Hobbes said, let's just imagine a world in which the state doesn't exist. Let's imagine a world in which there is no government. There's no police, there's no military, there's no court system, there's no laws, right? What would this natural state of human existence be like? What would this state of nature, as he called it, be like? It's an interesting question to ask, right? What would life be like without the state? And so the state of nature here is a state of human existence in which no one possesses political power. That's what Hobbes means by the state of nature. And so political power here meaning the right to command obedience, not just merely the power to force obedience, but the right to command obedience. And so if we live in a state of nature in which no one has political power, there's no police, there's no military, there's no courts, what would that be like? What would the state of nature be like? Well, for Hobbes, the state of nature is a state of war. It's the state of not constant fighting, but it's the state of perpetual fear and danger of violence, right? Like I said, other philosophers will reject Hobbes, this view of Hobbes. Locke will claim that the state of nature is not a state of war, but Hobbes at least claims that it's a state of war. You can kind of see the relevance of Hobbes for business ethics because many people believe that the business world is a state of war. You've probably heard the expression, it's not personal, it's just business, right? In other words, morality doesn't really apply here. We're kind of in this competitive environment of me against you. It's kind of a war here. That's, we kind of have a Hobbesian conception of business in America as well as elsewhere. We'll see that come out in Velasquez's arguments as well. Now, why does Hobbes think the state of nature is a state of war? He gives a number of reasons. On the first reason he gives here is we each of us have this unending search for felicity, which is another name for happiness, the satisfaction of our desires. We all have this unending, unsatiable search for the satisfaction of our desires, and so for power, or that we can satisfy our desires. Hobbes was a materialist, and what that means is it's not how we use the term today. He wasn't, searching for material goods. He was a materialist in the sense that he believed everything in the universe was material or physical. So there's no such thing as a soul. There's no such thing as gods or angels or demons. Everything in the universe is purely physical. And so everything in the universe can be explained by the science of physics, according to Hobbes. And at the time that he's writing, the scientific revolution's occurring. Physics is starting to come into its own. In fact, Galileo Galilei is writing, and Hobbes was a big fan of Galileo. He was close friends with Francis Bacon. And Galileo, for instance, put forward a theory called the conservation of motion. And the conservation of motion is basically this, right? When we think about it, right, if I throw a baseball, what's going to happen to that baseball over time? It's going to slow down. It's going to come to a rest, right? It's going to fall on the grass somewhere and just stop, right? So there's this sort of intuitive sense that things just naturally slow down, right? And that was the Aristotelian picture of things ever since Aristotle, that things naturally come to rest with time. Galileo challenged all that. Galileo said that, well, the only reason why the baseball comes to a rest is because there's another force acting on it. But if we were to throw the baseball in space and there were no other forces acting on it, the baseball wouldn't slowly come to a rest, right? The baseball would just continue on indefinitely until some other force prevents it from moving forward. And so there's this conservation of motion. Things just continue on in motion if they're in motion to begin with, or they continue at a state of rest if they're at rest to begin with. Hobbes agreed with Galileo here, and he applied the idea of the conservation of motion to the conservation of human desire, right? We are physical beings no less than the baseball is a physical being, according to Hobbes. And just like Galileo said, things will continue in motion until some outside force stops them. Hobbes argued that humans will continue to search for the satisfaction of their desires until some outside force stops them. Right? So this is the first condition for there being a state, the state of nature being a state of war. That will we all be wanting to get the satisfaction of our desires, felicity, as he called it. Another reason that the state of nature would be a state of war is what he calls a rough equality of strength and intelligence. So Hobbes grants some people are smarter than others, some people are stronger than others, some people are more athletic than others. But roughly speaking, there's no one of us that's so intelligent that they can outdo any number of us, or there's no one of us that's so strong, sort of like a superhero of sorts, such that the other of us can't sort of group together and undo that individual, right? So there's always this rough equality of strength and intelligence. We can always team up with others to undo those who might be in positions of power, whether it's in terms of smarts or strength. Third, there's a scarcity of resources in the state of nature. So we all have this unending desire to satisfy. We all have this unending search for felicity, right? And yet we can't all get what we want. There's a scarcity of resources. As you can see, these conditions in play here start leading towards this state of war in the state of nature. Remember, you can't call 911. There's nobody that can come to your aid. It's just you, your family, and whoever's on your team, right, to help you out. And so given those sets of circumstances, according to Hobbes, we get the presence of uncertainty, as he calls it, fear, and vulnerability, right? You just never know what's going to happen next. You don't know how many people are going to come around the corner and try to take what you have because they want it. And so if we don't have government, we get this state of war, this terrible state. And as you might imagine, Hobbes' answer to the question of what justifies the existence of the state is that we sort of sign a contract and say, all right, we'll give political power to the state. We'll sort of give up some of our freedoms to do that. That way we can get out of this state of war. That's generally the idea that he's after here. But a little bit more about this state of war, since it's been very influential, and this is what Velasquez will tap into when we get to multinationals. Here's probably the most famous quote in Leviathan, or from Hobbes. This is his description of the state of nature as a state of war. He writes, "In such condition, that is in the state of nature, there is no place for industry, so no place for business, because the fruit thereof is uncertain, and consequently no culture of the earth, no navigation, nor use of the commodities that may be imported by sea, no commodious building, no instruments of moving and removing such things as require much force, so no engineering, no knowledge of the face of the earth, no account of time, no arts, no letters, no society, and which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death, and the life of man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short." So there you have it. That's Hobbes' description of the state of nature as a state of war, a very unpleasant situation, right? And of course, Hobbes has to make it an unpleasant situation to give justification to the existence of government to begin with, right? That's why he's painting this terrible picture. And as I said before, Hobbes was living during a time that was, sort of immersed in violence in the English Civil War. Hobbes' own life was in danger. You can see how he was concerned that his government, England, was degenerating into a state of nature. And his solution to that will be to institute a strong sovereign to ensure that people don't resort to violence in those sort of situations. Now, this idea comes up all over the place in literature and art. Here I have a picture of Lord of the Flies. I'm sure many of you have read this by William Golding. Golding here gives us a Hobbesian picture of what the state of nature would be like. If you haven't read The Lord of the Flies, it's a story about how a number of English children or youths were sort of abandoned on a sort of a tropical island, right, without any adults and without any state, without any authority figures. And all goes well at first, but eventually it turns into desperate tribal warfare. And it's a very Hobbesian picture of what life would be like without the state. What few people realize is Golding was writing in response to a book that was written probably 100 years prior by R.M. Ballantyne called Coral Island. And Coral Island is a very similar tale. I think it was 3 British boys, again, on an island. But this time they managed to cooperate and repel invaders and live an idyllic life on the South Seas. And so you get these two very different pictures of what life would be like without government. Is it more like Golding, more like Hobbes, or is it more like Ballantyne? And we see this pop up in other mediums as well. If anybody's seen the show Lost, that kind of explores Hobbesian themes, or The 100, which is the more recent one, or Game of Thrones even taps into this sort of Hobbesian vision. Ask yourself, what would the state of nature be like if there was no government? What would life be like? And Hobbes tries to justify, if you would push back on whether or not the state of nature would be a state of war, Hobbes says, well, think about what you do now when you do have the government. How many of you lock your doors at night? How many of you keep a safe for your valuables? How many of you maybe have identity theft protection or whatever it happens to be? Hobbes says if that's what you do with the state, with the government, when you can dial 911, imagine what you would do if you didn't have the state, right? And so he's trying to make the case here the state of nature is a state of war. Now, what follows from that, from an ethical perspective? Well, according to Hobbes here, he puts forward a view known as realism. And realism is a very ambiguous term in ethics. It refers to a lot of different things which are kind of opposed to one another. But here what he means by realism is, let's be realistic here. Let's not be idealistic, right? If we're being idealistic, we might paint a rosy picture of human nature. Hobbes is a realist, he would argue, right? He's not, he's just going to paint it, he's going to tell you how it is. And if the state of nature is a state of war, it follows from that, according to Hobbes, that there's no morality, right? If there's any morality at all, the only moral sort of prescription is what he calls the right of nature. And the right of nature is anyone can do anything to preserve his or her own life in the state of nature. Right? Those are some strong claims. There's no other moral obligations other than that. If you need to preemptively strike on the neighboring community to preserve your own life, you can preemptively strike. Right? They may have done nothing wrong to you. There's no morality here. Here's another famous quote from Leviathan. To this war of every man against every man in the state of nature, this also is consequent, that nothing can be unjust. The notions of right and wrong, justice and injustice have there no place. Where there is no common power, so no state, there is no law. Where no law, no injustice. Force and fraud are in war the two cardinal virtues. And because the condition of man is a condition of war of everyone against everyone, in which case everyone is governed by his own reason, and there is nothing he can make use of that may not be a help unto him in preserving his life against his enemies, it followeth that in such a condition every man has a right to everything, even to one another's body, Hobbes writes. So he's not dancing around it. Morality does not exist in the state of nature. Now that's a pretty radical claim, right? Let me see if I can motivate it. I'm not a Hobbesian here. I'm going to argue against this. I'm going to argue against Velasquez a little bit if we have some time towards the end. But let me see if I can motivate it, right? This is good philosophical practice. Try to make your philosophical opponent as strong as possible. That way, if you can knock them down, then you're onto something. Suppose there's another ancient moral dilemma called the plank of Carneades, right? The plank of Carneades is a very simple ethical dilemma, or at least the situation is very simple. The issues are very complicated. Suppose you have two people, call them Smith and Jones. Smith and Jones they're in a shipwreck. They're in the water's freezing, right? And there's a plank of wood floating nearby. And if either of them stays in the water, they're doomed, right? They're destined to die if they stay in the water. Sure enough, Jones gets on the plank of wood first. And if he stays on the plank of wood, Smith is destined to die. But Smith paddles over, shoves Jones off the wood, climbs on himself, paddles away, leaves Jones to die. Has Smith done anything morally wrong? That's the moral dilemma that the ancient philosophers were considering. Has Smith done anything wrong? According to some, and of course this is controversial, according to some, Smith just acted in self-defense, right? No less than he would if there was somebody attacking him, right? We sometimes think, look, if somebody's attacking you, you can kill your attacker if it preserves your own life. Hobbes is basically arguing that the state of nature is a perpetual state of self-defense, right? We're in this state of war, and in a state of war, you can do whatever you need to do to preserve your own life, right? So the plank of Carneades example here illustrates where Hobbes is coming from. He might be wrong, right? We could talk about that, but where he's coming from here. And many people apply this kind of realism to war, right? So a lot of people will argue that when two nations go to war with one another, there really are no moral restraints or constraints here. We nowadays, even when we go to war, say there should be constraints. You can't use nuclear weapons, you can't use biological weapons, etc. You have to treat prisoners well. Realists argue, hey, it's war, it's self-defense. We're already killing people. There's no restrictions on what you're allowed to do when it's wartime. That's a Hobbesian picture applied to that sort of issue. Okay, so that's Hobbes' picture of the state of nature. Let's now transition to Velasquez and multinationals. How does that apply to Velasquez's argument? You can probably already see where he's going a little bit. So Velasquez here makes a distinction between private goods and common goods. This is not that controversial. Private goods are mutually exclusive goods. So, if I'm drinking this tea, you can't drink this tea, right? It's either or here. Whereas common goods are not exclusive and are accessible to all, right? So these are things that if I'm benefiting from the common good, that doesn't exclude you from potentially benefiting from the common good, right? John Rawls, for instance, another well-known political philosopher, defined the common good like this. He said, the common good I think of as certain general conditions that are in an appropriate equally to everyone's advantage, right? It's not a zero-sum game when it comes to common goods. They're to everyone's advantage. In addition, we can make another distinction among common goods, right? Between two levels. We can talk about common goods at the national level. These are goods that are to every citizen's advantage of a nation. Things like peace and order would be a common good in the nation, a clean natural environment, public health and safety, a just legal and political system. Assuming it is a common good, it's accessible to all, and that it's not exclusive. These would be common goods at the national level. But then we also have international common goods or global common goods. And this is where we get the title of multinationals and global common goods. This is what Velasquez will focus on. These are goods with which all the people of the world have an interest, right, or an advantage, in which they can all benefit. And so a congenial global climate, right, this is why climate change is such an important issue, because it's a global common good, right? A lot of people will be harmed if we don't do anything to mitigate climate change and global warming. And so it's a global common good to have a congenial global climate. There's others that he gives here. Safe transportation routes for the international flow of goods, clean oceans, avoidance of nuclear war, et cetera, all global common goods. So the question Velasquez is asking, what obligations do multinationals have to these sorts of things here, to the global good? His answer, they have none, which is kind of stark, right? Perhaps we could debate about congenial global climate. I think they do. We can talk about that. But it seems like it would also apply to the avoidance of nuclear war, which is a bit more drastic. So how does he use Hobbes, right? Well, first, we have to understand what he means by multinationals. So multinationals are profit-seeking enterprises. They're companies, right? They're immersed in a competitive free market environment. Their primary aim is to compete for profits. Right here you can see a number of companies and where they're operative throughout the world. According to Velasquez, they're also bureaucratic organizations. In other words, employees come and go, CEOs come and go, CIOs come and go, etc., right? But the identity, the structure, the objectives of the firm, roughly speaking, stay the same. And the reason why Velasquez focuses on that is he's going to say individual values come and go with people coming and going. But this will be relevant to his argument. And then finally, what's most obvious in terms of the term multinationals, multinationals operate in several nations, right? That's what makes them multinationals. Most companies today are multinationals, given the rise of globalization, not all, of course. And given that multinationals operate in several nations, they can easily escape the reach of the laws of any particular nation. and the interests of the firm need not be aligned with the interests of any single nation. And that's really what's going to create the problem, right? As you might guess, Velasquez is going to give the argument here. The international arena is a Hobbesian state of nature. There's no international sovereign. There's no international ruler to force moral compliance. And like Hobbes argued, if we're in a state of nature, we're in a state of war. And if we're in a state of war, there's no morality. And so Velasquez will argue when it comes to multinationals and the global common good, they have no obligation to the global common good because there's nobody to enforce the moral law. And if one company is going to move offshore, pollute the environment more because it's good for the bottom line, then other companies will be tempted to do the same, and they're not wrong to do the same because they will be at a competitive disadvantage if they don't, right? That's Velasquez's argument. So kind of laid out here in a sort of argument form. Moral concepts have no applicability in a state of nature. That's realism, right? That's Hobbes's view, since there's no sovereign to force compliance to the moral law. The international business arena is a state of nature. That's the second argument, the second claim, the second premise. So multinationals are likely to take advantage of the lack of any strong international authority, and hence moral concepts do not apply to multinationals, right? That's Velasquez's argument. You know, again, I don't agree. I'll offer some criticisms in a minute. But it's a good argument, right? And these are the kinds of arguments that one needs to wrestle with to try to make an impact on these sorts of issues here. I'll be curious to hear what you all have to say about it. So let me offer some criticisms very quickly here, and then I can open it up to some questions if you have any or comments. Again, these are just gestures at potential criticisms of Velasquez's argument. You know, that we could dig deeper into this. The first thing I would say in response is the analogy that Velasquez makes between a Hobbesian state of nature and multinationals, right? So he basically describes the international business arena as a state of nature, a Hobbesian state of nature. But remember, in the Hobbesian state of nature, what granted Hobbes the most plausibility for the right of nature, that we could do anything that we wanted, that there was no morality, was the fact that we were in a state of self-defense, right? We all tend to agree that if somebody's trying to hurt me and trying to attack me, if my life is in danger or maybe my health is seriously in danger, then perhaps I can use extreme measures. There are those who disagree, right? There are pacifists, but most people would argue in situations of self-defense, one can act in that way, that the traditional rules of morality don't apply in those situations. And what granted plausibility to Hobbes's contention, although we can fight back on it, was that a state of nature was a state of self-defense. But when it comes to multinationals, they're not in a state of self-defense. Their actual lives are not at risk. We might talk about the survival of the firm, right? Whether or not the business can survive. When we're talking about competitive disadvantage or advantage, we're talking about profit and whether or not the business can do well. But that's a separate matter, right? And so if there's any plausibility to Hobbes's conception of the state of nature, it doesn't necessarily transfer over to multinationals and the global common good. That's one of the first things I would say to Velasquez, which I don't think he's quite addressed. Connected with that, and this would be maybe more advice to business professionals, right? We could make a distinction between some business practices being intrinsically unethical. So there might be some business models that are just by their very nature unethical. So for instance, slave plantations in the South were intrinsically unethical, right? That very kind of business practice should not be done come what may, right? Given the immorality of slavery. But in a more complicated and less clear fashion, there might be extrinsically unethical business practices. These are business practices that perhaps aren't intrinsically unethical. There's nothing wrong with selling that product or doing it in that way. But it might be the case that in order to remain competitive in that kind of field, you have to engage in unethical practices, right? And that would be a business practice that's extrinsically unethical. an example might be something like, I'm not saying this is true, but maybe there's nothing unethical with running a casino, but in order to be competitive when you're running a casino, you have to do some shady things. That would be an extrinsically unethical business practice. And it seems like Velasquez here is trying to argue that this is not extrinsically unethical, what multinationals would be doing. I'm arguing that they would be extrinsically unethical. In other words, just don't go into that business, right? If that's the situation with multinationals when it comes to energy, let's say, energy production, that's not the business to go into if you can't avoid acting unethically in order to remain competitive. There's more to say there, but we'll leave it at that. We can also ask the more fundamental question, can we use people as means to our ends, even in self-defense, right? We can go back to the plank of Carneades example and ask whether or not it was legitimate for Smith to push off Jones and paddle away and leave Jones to die. Sometimes we want to say it's okay to use people as means to our ends in self-defense, but are there qualifications that we can make here? Generally speaking, I think it's a very good ethical principle which stems from philosophers like Thomas Aquinas and Immanuel Kant, that it's wrong to use people as means to our ends, even if our ends, our goals are good, right? Even if our goals are good, it's still wrong to use other people as mere means to produce that good outcome. It gets complicated, but as a general rule of thumb, I think that's pretty good. And then finally, and this also gets to the heart of Velasquez's argument, I think, is if business engages in unethical practices, which is what Velasquez is essentially recommending with multinationals, the free market model loses its original ethical sanction, right? So the free market model here referring to capitalism. What most people don't realize is capitalism, I mean, maybe people do realize this, capitalism was first put forward in any sort of robust form by Adam Smith, who was a 18th century philosopher. In fact, he was a professor of moral philosophy at the University of Glasgow. And his whole reason for putting forward or recommending a capitalist system, economic system, right, the free market model, was because he believed, we could dispute this as well, but he believed that it would lead to a better society. It would help everybody out in society, right? It would lift all boats, so to speak. If that's the case, if the original sanction, the original stamp of approval on business practices in that kind of competitive environment is ethically oriented, then whenever somebody argues that businesses should act unethically to remain competitive, they've cut the knees right from underneath them, right? Because the whole point of that kind of competition is to produce an ethical result. And so one can't argue really that businesses should be allowed to act unethically. So those will be 4 points of pushback on Velasquez's argument. Again, like I said, there's plenty more that we could dig into here. But I'm 40 minutes in here. I'll leave it at that. If there's any questions, comments, I'd love to hear what you guys all have to think. Thanks so much for attending. Any thoughts? Yeah, go ahead. It looks like Cindy here.
So how much of this do you think is related to the doctrine of discovery?
Yeah, what do you mean by the doctrine of discovery exactly?
Well, the doctrine of discovery is basically the Christian, values of domination and genocide, to just take whatever you want to take, and whatever resources we want, we can just take. We can kill as many animals as we want. We can use people for slavery. Isn't that kind of similar to what this is all about?
Yeah, I think it is. Yeah, it's a good question. I think that it kind of goes back to the third point here, this idea that we can use people as mere means to our own ends, right? And, I think you're bringing up a good point, because multinationals are operating in other countries that have different cultures, right? They might view ethics different, right? Or they might have different norms. And there comes, it's almost quite clear that often these multinationals are exploiting those sorts of situations, right? You might argue this is the sort of new doctrine of discovery, perhaps. Maybe it's not religiously based as it once was. Maybe it's economically based. And so I think that, if you look at, for instance, the handling of toxic waste in particular, this makes it really stark, I think, which is, we wouldn't allow American citizens to handle this kind of material, and yet we're shipping it. And sending it to other countries who don't even know the risk, and they're not even wearing the proper equipment to handle it, and yet that's what they're doing. And so, yeah, I think there's certainly a connection here between the two. I see David here has his hand up as well.
Yeah, that was a really interesting question about the discovery doctrine. I have a somewhat different question. Multinational corporations operate across national borders, but they are in fact chartered by nations. They're protected and empowered in all kinds of ways by the laws of their chartering nations. So shouldn't those nations be able to regulate corporate behavior even in an international context? And I'm also thinking about how the US State Department, if you think about, well, not only when it comes to diplomacy, but also trade regulations, governments like the United States do all kinds of advocacy and policy making that greases the wheels of international trade. So corporations are getting a massive benefit out of the existence of the law, which does in fact bind nations together into a meaningful international community. There are all kinds of treaties and agreements. And so it does seem to me that, an argument about a state of nature is utter nonsense. I'll leave it at that. I'm curious to hear what you think about, the way that law could provide a context for imposing moral behavior on corporations. And maybe that gets a little bit beyond what you're talking about. If it seems like there's a question of should corporations take this on themselves versus should they go along with regulation as opposed to spending a lot of money to fight regulation, which has often been the case. All right, I'll leave it at that. Thanks, Sam.
No, it's a great question. And a lot of people push back on Velasquez at this very point. They want to argue that, so in one sense, we have two kinds of premises in his argument. We have an ethical premise, which says, if there's a state of nature, morality doesn't apply. And then we have the empirical premise, which is to say that currently the international arena is a state of nature. A lot of people like to go after that empirical premise. My view is that the ethical premise, though, is the more interesting one, because I want to say that even if it were a state of nature, it would still be unethical for multinationals to act in that way. Climate change is a sort of case in which indirect harm is done, but an implication of Velasquez's argument would be if one multinational company is using slave labor in a country, then he would have to argue that any multinational company can use slave labor in that country. And that, to me, even if there was a state of nature, right, in the international arena, would be wrong. And so that's where the real kernel or the interesting ethical truth will come. But you're right insofar as I think a lot of people want to push back on the empirical premise to say, well, maybe we're not in a state of nature. I suspect Velasquez would argue something like this. He would argue it might be true, for instance, that the United States, say, could, so multinationals is a distinction between their home country, where they're sort of based, and the host country, right, where they're operating, or countries. Suppose you have a U.S. company, so its home country is in the United States, and the U.S., as it does, say, has laws against bribery in other countries and so on and so forth. That might be true. And so those multinational companies, which are housed in the United States, would be limited on what they can do. They would be subject to legal recourse if, in fact, people were to follow that that path, right? But Velasquez would argue, what about those multinationals housed in other countries, right? What about those multinationals that are in a country that doesn't have strict regulations? Those multinationals will start taking advantage of lax laws elsewhere. And so that will put the US companies at a competitive disadvantage. And in that situation, according to Velasquez, the US companies do nothing morally wrong, even though they might do something illegal, if they were also to engage in that practice. And so what is needed here is an international authority, right? And as you noted, there are international measures used to, or ways of doing this, right? There's the international court, there's international law. I suspect Velasquez would argue it's simply not effective. So it's not that there isn't anything in place. It's just that there's nobody really to enforce it or effectively. Again, we could push back on that as well. Some other arguments in this vein, since it's a good question, and I'll just hone on it a little bit more, that he gives is, he goes back to the nature of multinationals. So, for instance, some want to argue we wouldn't have a state of nature in the international arena because if the process is iterative, if I'm going to come in contact with another business in a repeated fashion and they sort of burn me once on a deal, then I'm not going to engage with them the second or third time, right? But Velasquez argues that in the case of the climate, for instance, if we fail at this, it's just a one-time failure. So we won't ever get to the point where we'll have this iteration, right? So we'll have this sort of slippery slope. And once we've hit that tipping point, there won't be a chance to self-correct, right? And so sometimes he argues we don't need a strong authority in order to enforce compliance. Sometimes we can do that ourselves if the process is iterative. But he argues in the particular case of global common goods, we don't have that kind of situation. In addition, he argues that given the nature of bureaucratic organizations, people come and go, and so their values come and go. We've kind of seen this recently with the Paris Climate Accord, right? We have one leader who sets it up. We have another leader who pulls out of it, right? There's this sense of instability or unreliability in terms of who's sticking with particular goals and particular proposals. Again, those are Velasquez's arguments in that sense of playing devil's advocate, but really good questions. So it looks like Elise Cohen here asks, given the limitations of international law, do you think public pressure on multinational corporations from civil society holds the greatest potential for prompting more ethical behavior? Yeah, it's a good question how to handle this. I mean, certainly that is an important role. You know, what we have here is a standard, what's called a standard prisoner's dilemma, right? And, you know, as an example of a prisoner's dilemma, another philosopher, a French philosopher, Jean-Paul Sartre, gave this scenario. He said, suppose we all own a plot of land. I have my plot of land, you have your plot of land. We're all trying to make a profit by growing corn, say. And if we were to all cut down the trees on our plot of land, we could grow more corn, right, and make more profit, right? But here's the issue. If we all did that, if a heavy rain came, it would wipe away the soil. And so none of us could grow any corn and we'd all be ruined, right? And so the prisoner's dilemma is basically each of us individually has an incentive to do what's individually rational in terms of self-interest, right? We can cut down the trees on our plot and make more money. And so competitively get an advantage over you if you do the morally right thing and don't cut down your trees, right? And so the prisoner's dilemma, that's the prisoner's dilemma, right? When we have that competition between individual self-interest and collective interest. How do you solve those kinds of situations, right? That's kind of the question here. Typically, the idea here is kind of what Hobbes was suggesting. You need some kind of authority to make sure we punish those who cut down their trees when they're not allowed to cut down their trees, right? We need to tax those who are emitting too much carbon when they're not supposed to emit that much carbon. But when it comes to global common goods, we need an international authority to do this, right? You know, how do we do that? I mean, one thing I would argue is It's in the company's interest if they want to be ethical. It's in their interest to push legislation, international legislation, to hold everybody accountable rather than to push against it. I think too often these companies are pushing against. They're lobbying for policies that go against environmental regulation. But really, if they push for policies that were for environmental regulation, they could still be competitive. They could still make a profit and yet do the ethical thing. So I think that'll be a big part of it. That might come from consumers pushing multinationals in that direction. But at the end of the day, it's going to have to be these big players that are whether it's nations, the international community generally, or multinationals themselves. And there has, I think, to David's point, there has been efforts along those lines to do that. Yeah, good questions. Other thoughts or questions here? I think Chris here's got his hand up.
Yeah, Zan, I have a theoretical question on the first premise of the moral concepts in the state of nature. And the question sort of goes as follows. When you were talking about Hobbes and the state of nature, my first thought was that Hobbes has this famous discussion at the end of the Leviathan, I think, of the fool, where the fool is basically someone who says, look, I think it's smart for me to be duplicitous, to lie and cheat and steal my way, to get out of obligations I don't want to obey. And Hobbes sort of famously says, you can't respond, you can't convince the fool that the fool is wrong. The fool can only sort of learn this in time, right? So that the fool can't be convinced otherwise. Now, for us as people, the problem of the fool is that living that kind of lifestyle is just morally detrimental. It's not a fun life to live when you're constantly having to hold a bunch of lies in place and what have you. So we can readily see how for humans, let's say, Hobbes' response to the fool works. And so my first thought for you was, are there moral concepts in the state of nature? Well, even Hobbes seems to think, yeah, there are, because there's something right about about the argument against the fool. But, right, so here's my question for you. So I want to put on, so I'm on your side here, but I want to put on my Velasquez hat here, because I think, right, the fool is a fool, but that is a human being. And when we think about, as you were defining multinational organizations, they are by definition structural. The people come and go. So the argument against the fool works for international organizations, because international organizations are not things that are going to feel worse about their actions down the line in the way that humans might, right? Multinational organizations that cheat and lie and steal aren't going to live a worse life for multinational organizations in the way that humans do. So if I'm Velasquez, what if I say to you, look, because the identity of the multinationals is purely structural, the argument from the fool doesn't work. And that's why the moral concept, so premise one, the moral concept in nature doesn't apply. It truly is, no laws whatsoever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks, Chris. That's a great question. So the idea here would almost be this is a defense of the first premise here, that it is a kind of state of nature because given the bureaucratic nature of multinationals, if I'm understanding you correctly, Chris. I mean, what I would argue, though, is at the end of the day, even though legally speaking, companies can be persons, right, so to speak, companies are really just organizations of real living, breathing individuals, right? And, I take a sort of Lockean view of this. Locke would argue that in the state of nature, morality does exist. I think Hobbes probably thinks that as well. He's just saying that traditional morality doesn't exist, that the only moral law is the right of nature, so to speak. And so if that's the case, even if there's no international sovereign that can regulate these behemoths that are multinational companies, and if we're dealing with real living, breathing people in the multinational organizations, as well as those they're affecting, I would argue that they still have moral obligations for that first point that I made, which is it's not a state of self-defense. That you only really get to question traditional morality, and even this can be disputed, but you only really get to question traditional morality when that condition of self-defense comes into play. If we're just talking about profit, if we're just talking about, well, now, hey, my company can't compete against this other company because they're doing the unethical thing, that is not enough, in my view, to say that traditional morality no longer applies. Again, that's assuming I understand your question, your point here, Chris. Now, they might be, it's funny you mentioned the point about the fool, because in game theory, when you start talking about the prisoner's dilemma, the person who doesn't do the individually rational thing, the person who doesn't exploit the resources is sometimes called a sucker, right? That's the person who, isn't doing the thing that would benefit their own interest. But while that might be the case from a game theoretic perspective, I still think morality has to apply in those particular situations. Not only because it's not a state of self-defense, but also because the very justification for the competitive environment itself is ethical in nature, right? As I said with that fourth point. What then would be the justification for these multinationals if it wasn't, contributing to the greatest good? And in the absence of that, I don't know what the justification of it could be. But yeah, I mean, these are good points. Other thoughts? Or Chris, you can respond too if you want.
No, I very much appreciate the international organizations can only do what they do, morally or immorally, within a certain basic kind of moral fabric or moral system. And that moral system is binding on them, whether they are people or not. So I was hoping you would say something that would convince me that even multinational organizations are morally flawed, and I wasn't sure that you could, but you did. So I appreciate it. Thanks.
Cool. Yeah, thanks, Chris. Other thoughts, questions? Well, thanks so much, everyone. I guess we're kind of out of time anyways, but thanks for the discussion. This was really great. If you have other thoughts, please feel free to email me. I've been thinking about these issues for a while now. So please, please send any comments, questions, solutions in particular my way. So much appreciated. Thanks to everyone.